YouTube Live. And if you're checking this out for the first time, the goal of this live stream is to support and serve the needs of nurse educators in the trenches, to empower you with practical strategies to develop clinical judgment so students are better prepared for both practice and licensure. I've been traveling the last month, and so we haven't had a Facebook Live for almost 5 or 6 weeks now. And so I've been traveling every week. I did a couple vendors at a couple of conferences. I spoke last week at the Kansas Associate Degree Nursing Consortium in Kansas to over 100 educators. It was a wonderful opportunity and just a blessing to do a day-and-a-half workshop, 10 hours of Keith RN. Can you imagine that? I can't, but I got through it, had a wonderful time, and just empowering educators with best practices, developing judgment in both classroom, clinical, our content, etc. was such a blessing. So it's good to be back. And tonight, I am so excited to have with you a guest, Lisa Gonzalez, and we're going to be talking about developing clinical reasoning strategies to develop the outcome of clinical judgment that's essential for safe practice and licensure. Now, Lisa has done something I haven't done yet, but I'm hoping to do soon, and that is get published in the nursing literature. Lisa has been blessed and has contributed to our body of knowledge with a couple of articles in the nursing literature. I'm just going to pop in there. The first one is Clinical Reasoning Piece by Piece. I'm going to share the abstract to PubMed. And what I'd like you to do if you're watching this is your homework. Lisa's got something to say. And we're going to ask questions. We're going to have a chance to really dig down deep into how do we develop clinical judgment most effectively in the clinical, and then how do we integrate that into our curriculum? And so these are 2 articles that if you've got your CINAHL database and you are a nurse educator, dig right in, get the full text, and have that as a resource. And if you're here tonight, I just want to say welcome. And I just want to say thank you for taking the next, we'll do this for probably about an hour. We're going to have a lot of things to talk about. You don't want to miss it. But I want to thank you for attending. If you're watching this live, I want you to put your name, where you're coming at us from tonight. I'm coming at you from Andover, Minnesota, a northern suburb here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And it's my pleasure. Lisa's coming to you from the East Coast. I think she's from Maryland somewhere. I don't know what city. We'll get to that. But she's on the East Coast an hour later than we are. So it's a pleasure to have you all here, and just love to know who's out there tonight. And Carol, you are a fan. You are here every week. It's a pleasure, Carol, to have you here, connected in the Facebook group. Thank you for joining us tonight. We've got Vicki from New York. Thank you, Vicki, for joining us tonight. Diane from Florida. Again, we've got the Seaboard, the Eastern Seaboard represented, and Laurel from Portland, Oregon. Thank you so much, Laurel, for joining us tonight. And if you've got, I know we've got many others out there. You don't have to do this. I'm not trying to call you out, but it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. We've got Debbie from Iowa. Boy, got a lot of people just popping in here. Sherry, thank you for joining us from Ohio. And Dr. Hall from Texas, and someone from Cali who doesn't want to introduce, that's okay. And Jill from Southern Maryland. Professor Gonzalez, you must know Jill Shade. I think she's a student. Wonderful. Because Lisa's also a current educator as well in Apple in West Virginia. So anyways, let me just let you know who I am. If you haven't joined this Facebook Live and saying, who is this person in the salmon colored shirt? My name is Keith. I'm the founder of Keith RN. And really, I developed this ministry 10 years ago that's kind of grown quite a bit as a resource to help educators teach and develop and practice clinical judgment. And my why do I do what I do? Why am I here tonight where I could be taking it easy and just really kind of reading a good book? Because I want to empower you as educators to close the ongoing academic practice gap, to strengthen and practice readiness and the clinical judgment that's needed for safe practice and licensure. And also to be a part, kind of rock the boat. Anybody here want to rock the boat to improve practice readiness and really begin to change culture from NCLEX success to preparing for practice? We can do both. We're going to talk about that with Lisa and how we can do that. And so anyways, every one of you watching this are part of the needed change. And I want to thank you for being a part of that. I've been doing these Facebook Lives every other week for about the last 2 years. I just like you to know that if you're watching this on Facebook Live or YouTube Live, I just want you to know these live on my Facebook channel, Think Like a Nurse. And so I've done other episodes on clinical judgment, everything from A to Z and everything in between. So if you've missed some of those topics, please go ahead and go ahead and either subscribe to my YouTube channel and see what's new every other week, as well as other content there that you can use with your students. Got some great videos for 3 to 5 minutes that you can show in your classroom on professional behavior. Don't be that nurse. Some fun topics. So again, check that out if you haven't yet. And I also want to commend you to an article. We got some homework tonight. Every one of us need to be aware and well-versed in Tanner's clinical judgment model, because we're going to be talking about Tanner's framework. And what's really interesting to me as an educator, when I go and speak across the country, I'd say less than 20% of educators consistently have heard of Tanner's clinical judgment model and even know what it is, or have read about it, or know of it. And it is foundational for us as nurse educators to understand, apply, and integrate Tanner's model. And that's exactly what Lisa's going to do tonight. So stay tuned as we go deep in the weeds in a good way in developing clinical judgment that's needed for both safe practice and licensure. And I'm going to commend you to one more document before we get started with Lisa, and that is a rubric called Lassiter's Clinical Judgment Rubric, developed by Kathy Lassiter, a colleague of Chris Tanner in 2007. The beauty of Lassiter's rubric, because Lisa's also going to be talking about that. And so when she gets into clinical evaluation and ways that we can develop clinical skills of clinical reasoning, Lassiter's rubric basically takes Tanner's 4 steps of noticing, interpreting, responding, and reflecting that align with nursing process, and then basically expands it and deconstructs it further into 10 steps that further define how you notice more effectively. And I'm going to let Lisa talk about that. I'm not going to go there right now. So anyways, that is foundational. These are 2 tools and 2 articles you need to know as an educator. So I commend you to them. The rubric is just a rubric. There is a rubric. There is an article in 2007. Lisa may know it when we open her up here in just a moment, what that article is that we can refer you to her when she published that in 2007. But I'm going to introduce to you my guest, Lisa Gonzalez. I'm just going to put her in the chat because she's been hiding for way too long. Good to have you here, Lisa. Let me introduce you because you kind of, I don't know if there's such a thing, Lisa, but, I've heard of fangirling. I don't know if fanboying is a thing. I've never heard the term, but I'm a fan of yours.
I love it.
I saw you speak at the Nurse Educator in the Conference Rockies in July. I was looking for you because I read your articles and I said, I want to meet her. And so it is just my pleasure, but I want to introduce you first, but I just want to let you know I'm a fan. And every educator who's listening to this, I want them to be a fan because you have something to say, Lisa, and the platform will be yours in just a moment after I introduce you, like a good conference speaker. So Lisa Gonzalez, she is currently pursuing her doctorate in nursing and is a professor at the College of Southern Maryland, teaching into both adult med-surg and clinical courses. And like me, she's a kindred spirit. She is passionate to develop the clinical reasoning that students need in the clinical environment and has developed a concept-based approach grounded in clinical reasoning that was published in 2018 in the top-tier journal of nursing education. And through her presentations and publications, Lisa is focused on helping faculty integrate clinical reasoning and clinical judgment within the curriculum using practical and evidence-based approaches. And she also co-authored in 2021 with Kathy Lassiter and Ann Nielsen, some clinical judgment heavyweights, an article titled Developing Students' Clinical Reasoning Skills, a Faculty Guide. That as well as a must read. I already shared that link with you. Lisa, it is a pleasure to have you here today. And so thank you for taking time out of your Eastern. It's getting late on the East Coast, but you're here tonight and you're a mother. You got 5 kids and a 2-year-old.
Luckily, we're hanging in there. But yes, it is late for us. So hopefully I don't say anything goofy. I will blame it on just being a little bit tired and having sick kids. But it is so good to be here. And honestly, I think that's hilarious that you started off with that, Keith, because I was going to tell the same story, how we met in Colorado this past summer. I was doing a presentation and joined this great conference, a Midwest conference. And then I saw Keith in the audience. And it's been interesting because I feel like we've been having parallel conversations. We've both been thinking about clinical reasoning, clinical judgment, and just practical strategies. Because sometimes clinical reasoning and clinical judgment could be a concept that sort of sometimes feels up in the air, at least definitely for students. But even for us sometimes, how are they different? What is it all about? And then how do we bring this down into practical ways that we can help our students? But I was definitely a fan, and it was great meeting you as well, and just being able to connect. And iron sharpens iron. So it's great when you're able to collaborate with others on these kinds of projects and things. So,
and we've got,
you guys.
We've got dozens of educators joining us tonight as well, Lisa. So we have an opportunity to get some questions. I want you to know that this is going to be a dialogue. I'm going to lead the dialogue, but if they have questions, we have a conversation really is what this is. But in essence, if you have questions for Lisa as we dig into her content and some of the things we need to discuss about, Lisa, I would just like to start with what you already kind of talked about. Let's define our terms for the, you talked about, clinical reasoning, clinical judgment. Are they the same thing? Are they synonyms, or are they distinctly, what is it, so that we as educators can confidently develop clinical reasoning skills that lead to the outcome of clinical judgment, and that's kind
Absolutely.
I'd love to get your thoughts, Lisa, as far as how do you define it, kind of like from your lens as an expert who's operationalized Tanner's framework of clinical judgment and other approaches. I'd love to get your thoughts.
Well, Tanner was definitely influential for me. And of course, Lassiter clinical judgment rubric. So Kathy Lassiter's work was really influential too. But I feel like sometimes we think about clinical reasoning and clinical judgment, especially what I've seen in the literature, is there's a lot of times that we use those terms interchangeably. We use it with the nursing process, critical thinking. But, at the simplest form, clinical reasoning and clinical judgment, I think of them as, there's an old saying in nursing that, sometimes you can have the right thinking, wrong action, or you can have the wrong thinking, right action. And it's like, well, how do you get to, if you have a multiple choice question, it's a multiple guess, really. So how do you get to the right action? Did you have good thinking behind it? And so I feel like the thinking behind the actions is definitely the clinical reasoning. And, your clinical judgment, it's your decision. Maybe you've, thought about the clinical picture, and then you made a decision based on what you think how you interpreted the situation. Then maybe you make a decision what intervention you're going to implement. And then maybe you make a decision either to continue assessing or to start doing evaluation. So I feel like, clinical reasoning can be a little tricky because there's a lot of cognitive elements involved in it. So it's in a way, it's an unseen type of process in a lot of ways. I was at a conference one time and they showed an iceberg as an example of nurse thinking. And this was maybe like 8 years ago when we were just starting to really start this conversation. But there was a concern that, how do you teach students all the stuff under the iceberg when what you see, if you're sitting in a room, you're a patient's family member, you're sitting in the room and you're watching a nurse do their thing. You see them hang the IV, you see them, start an IV, you see them give medications, you see them put the patient up in the bed. Okay, you see those actions, right? Those are some of the clinical judgments. But how did the nurse get to the point where those were the best actions for the patient in that time, and that they understood the need for those types of interventions? So that's what they were talking about when they showed the iceberg, is all that stuff underneath of it is that sort of gray area of how do we teach that to students then? And then how do we know whether or not they're understanding that? So because it's a lot of the clinical reasoning part is unseen processes. So clinical reasoning, definitely, I see it as the cognitive processes. Clinical judgment is the outcomes or the decisions behind the thinking.
And so even though Tanner's clinical judgment model is called the clinical judgment model, I think when you really understand it, Lisa, would you agree that it's really a clinical reasoning model, that those four processes? And could you explain, I've been talking about Tanner's framework for years. I'd love to hear your kind of how you understand Tanner and those 4 steps of just reasoning so you can kind of lay the foundation for the things we're going to talk about tonight with your articles. So we can really kind of make clinical reasoning clear. And I think Tanner's framework does a very nice job of that. And so I'll let you I'd love to get your insights.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been thinking about this for a while just because people ask me a lot of times is how do you reconcile all these different things? We have Tanner's model, we have Lassiter's rubric, we have nursing process, we have the National Council State Board of Nursing clinical judgment measurement model. And so I've been thinking about this, and I feel like, now that I'm in my PhD program and they're teaching us theoretical and the importance of theory development and all these things, I feel like Tanner's clinical judgment model, amazing model. It really starts us at that theoretical level of, okay, what is the nurse doing? And so in order, there's a few different clinical reasoning concept analysis out there right now, or articles that really break down what clinical reasoning is. I think one came from a Delphi study recently. If I have links handy, I can find them, I can put them in there. But basically, what is said now of clinical reasoning is something needs to initiate the process of clinical reasoning. If you're walking around the hallways with your patients, go in and out of the room, nurses think a lot. This is true. But what initiates the nurse to be like, all right, I need to use some clinical reasoning here? And what they're thinking is it really kind of starts at that noticing piece. You walk in a room and all of a sudden something sort of cues you. You're like, that patient was not breathing like that when I came in last time. So then they notice something. And so then that noticing turns into, I think interpreting, I think there's something not quite right with the situation. And one thing that we've learned about clinical reasoning is they call it like an iterative process, meaning it's not linear, like we have created the nursing process to be in our practice, but it's you're bouncing around back and forth or returning back. So in my example of that patient's not breathing quite right, well, now I've interpreted that, and I've interpreted this as maybe a big issue that I don't want to walk out of the room right now, but I'm going to go back to noticing. I'm going to go back and see what else do I need to learn about the situation? What else do I need to explore and notice? Then going to interpreting again, and maybe finally towards a response. And then of course, responding or your different interventions, you're different prioritizing the interventions. Maybe your responding is, hey, I need to go tell somebody. I need to call a rapid response. So even moving from noticing to interpreting to responding, there's cognitive processes, there's decision points. I like to tell my students a lot of times when I'm teaching them clinical reasoning and when we're in class, unpacking the material, talking about all the different things we talked about. Recently in class, we've had septic shock. We've talked about our shocks. We're talking about strokes. But what are those decision points? Like, what does the nurse need to think about in order to get from noticing to interpreting to responding? So that piece is as well is included. But then you're reflecting. So you're reflecting, we call it evaluating a lot of times in the nursing process, right? You're kind of thinking, how is this patient doing? Where are we at? But, nurses, when we're learning a practice, sometimes you're questioning yourself. You're reflecting on the situation. Like, did I notice everything I needed to notice for that patient? What can I do differently for the next time I see a patient like that? So that's that reflection on action type of piece, which Tanner does a really great job explaining. Now, the one thing, so then you have your theoretical model, your Tanner's clinical judgment model, great model. Then coming down a little bit from that to make it even more operational and practical is Lassiter's clinical judgment rubric. So at my school, we actually use Lassiter's clinical judgment rubric for our clinical evaluation tool. And so I imagine I'm going to have a little bit more of a chance later, so I won't go into it too much right now. I'll just answer the question, but that's where my clinical education curriculum kind of jumped from. So I'll talk about that later. But Lassiter's clinical judgment rubric kind of goes in even more detail. Okay, so not only are we noticing as a nurse, but we're noticing with a purpose. We have a focused observation. Nurses aren't just willy-nilly, like they have a purpose and an intention with their observation skills. It's one thing to be a nurse and to be like, something's not right with the patient, but then walk out of the room. No, nurses, no, they go into their focus observation and then they start collecting more information. So there's steps, there's things within noticing. So Tanner's noticing and Lassiter's clinical judgment rubric kind of dives into a little bit more of what's happening. And so then the next piece is what I'll talk about, it's, a little bit here, I imagine, but is how do you operationalize this for real world practice? And so one thing that I did with my clinical reasoning education curriculum is I'm like, okay, so focus observation, that's great. How do we, bring it even more down to real world practice? What do my students need to do in order to get a good focus observation in order to do really good noticing? So it goes back to the theory. And I thought, well, I'm going to teach them how to do focus assessments then, because if you know what to look for, if, I always tell them focus assessment, if your patient's going to decline, it's usually in that focus assessment. So if you're staying on top of your patient and you want to catch things early, do a focused assessment. And this is how nurses use focus assessment in real practice. And this is the purpose of it, to catch patient decline early, to maintain a certain kind of baseline understanding of your patient. This is how nurses do it. And then just teach them practical things. If I have a patient come in with a stroke, I'm going to complete a focus assessment NIH score, a focus assessment neuro, and I have to chart it in the computer. And this is how, this is where you can find it in the computer. So, I don't like to make things very mysterious for students. I just feel like there's no point to that. I want you to be a nurse. I want you to be a good nurse. And this is just what nurses do. And this is the step-by-step of how to learn this process. And then here, now you get to practice. So I always like to empower my students whenever I can. But I feel like that's kind of, to me, how you can go from Tanner's clinical judgment model, which is a great theoretical model. And she does an amazing job explaining the clinical reasoning behind it. Like you said, Keith, if you read the article, you'll see how she explains the thinking behind it, which is the clinical reasoning. And then down to last year's clinical judgment rubric, which makes it more operational. And since it's a rubric, you as an educator can kind of sort of evaluate, assess, have these conversations with your students. This is what's part of noticing. This is what's part of interpreting. And then they're able to develop it. And then my clinical reasoning curriculum, it is for clinical education. But who's to say somebody doesn't want to do something with it in the classroom or the lab? But it's to help them. To help bridge the gap between the thinking and teaching the thinking skills and the doing, and how to make it operationalize it with the students when they're working with their patients. So that way they can build their thinking while understanding that it's not just theoretical, but it's actually, I'm making a difference to a patient. And this is how nurses really do it in practice. We're all busy, right? So I always tell my students, I'm like, I'm not here to waste your time. Like, I really want you to learn the things you're going to actually need to know how to do. And I want to give you time to be able to do them. So I see a question. I don't know if I can.
Let's go ahead and you know what? I've just been looking at some other things here, but yeah, Vicky said, let's just pop on the screen. It says, are focused assessments based upon understanding the basic concepts?
Oh, I think that's a good question. So two things I want to add to the conversation. One, I do teach conceptually, because I do think that you do have to have a basic conceptual understanding. And I do think it's a great way to teach a student, because you're not going to learn everything. You're not going to learn, I tell them, I'm like, I can't teach you how to make every single decision you might need to know how to make, but I can teach you how to think about it in a conceptual way, so that way you can apply those skills no matter the situation. Now, the other piece is the actual physiologic type of content, type of concepts, correct? So in a way, and I use this with my third semester nursing students. I'm in a 4-semester associate degree nursing student. So they come with a certain foundational knowledge. Now they started using it in first semester med search, which is second semester, because I have it's second semester students. But as far as foundational students, you know what? I feel like you can still start the conversations, because you teach them assessment, right? And so then maybe you'll just teach them, all right, so here's your head to toe assessment. And then here's a little bit more in depth about a cardiac assessment. And sometimes, I don't know how you would do this exactly. I would love to hear from you guys who teach first semester. But I feel like you could easily just say, all right, guys, so we did a cardiac assessment. What is important about a cardiac assessment for a patient who comes in, something that you're learning about first semester, something basic. So you can use those exemplars absolutely of like the different conditions and stuff, but it can still come back to a overall conceptual understanding. So I feel like either way, our focus assessments based on understanding basic concepts. Either way, you could take it at the very basic level of head to toe assessment versus here's your cardiac focused assessment. And for my students, I really do like to stick with that at first. So, for example, this week in clinical, we took a lot of stroke patients because we're learning about stroke in theory. And so I'm their theory instructor, I'm their clinical instructor. So there's really great alignment there for some of them. For some of them, I have just a small group of clinical students. So I, ask them, guys, what's your focus assessment? Neuro. Okay, great. Well, what are you going to include in your neuro assessment? Well, some things that they learned about in theory, but then I also showed them the NIH stroke scale, and then we have a Q4-hour scale that includes the Glasgow coma scale. So then we get in conversations about these focus assessments that are evidence-based, that are tools that are documented in your computer system versus your neural assessment, maybe level of consciousness, you keep checking on them throughout the shift, just something that I'm using as a monitoring tool to be able to recognize any acute patient decline. So,
and I would ask you, Lisa, and you allude this into your first article in 2018, teaching clinical reasoning piece by piece, but I'd love to get your feedback because you're a critical care nurse like myself. But you had an interesting insight about the importance of pathophysiology to developing some of these, that pathophysiology, the knowledge and understanding of patho, and your ability to notice and interpret, which are the first two steps of clinical reasoning, using Tanner's framework as a practice-informed framework. Like your thoughts on patho. Is it optional, or how do we need to teach patho differently?
Oh, I love
to understand it, because that's foundational to clinical reasoning. There's an intersection. Mm-hmm. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Because with clinical reasoning, so that's one reason why it's important to differentiate clinical reasoning from critical thinking. Critical thinking, you're putting pieces together, you're analyzing, yes, but clinical reasoning is very specific to working with patients. And so that pathophysiology is absolutely essential. So I love patho. I always tell my students, if you understand patho, you can generate your knowledge from there. If you understand patho, you can build, we teach the framework, Tanner's clinical judgment model. We teach the framework. I teach Lassiter's as well in theory. But then we start with patho, and there's sometimes where we just unpack it. I'm like, okay, if this is happening, then what do you think you're going to see and why? So I do want to say something kind of that I feel like is really important, especially when you're thinking about conceptual teaching. I do want to make sure I highlight that there is a very important difference between like a concept-based curriculum versus conceptual teaching. So conceptual teaching, concept-based curriculum, I know enough about it, but I've never had to teach in one. But concept-based curriculum always comes across to me as, how can you replace the content? How can you, what you want in your curriculum, like the exemplars, right? So you're not going to teach certain disease processes and stuff. But I would caution us to be careful, because you want the students to understand certain pathophysiology for certain disease processes, because that's how they come to understand the difference between an oxygenation issue for a patient with a pulmonary embolism versus an oxygenation issue for somebody who's coming in with a myocardial infarction. I mean, you're going to respond vastly different. And if you're just looking at oxygenation as just oxygenation, and you're just teaching, do this always for oxygenation, okay, yeah, you can put oxygen on somebody always for oxygenation, but there's going to be a whole set of protocols and interventions that need to be done. And we can't just be like, okay, we're done with that, put oxygen on the patient with MI. No, I mean, thank you for giving them oxygen, but what's happening in that artery in their heart? And time is tissue, right? So if we don't teach the pathophysiology, I think we lose that opportunity to create the sense of urgency. And for our students, especially when these patients are really, these conditions that the patients can deteriorate pretty quickly. But I think we also miss an opportunity to help our students, give them the skills that they need to practice the decision making. because if they're presented with a patient and they have that foundation of pathophysiology, then their wheels can start turning and they can start thinking through it themselves. They could be like, all right, this patient looks like a patient that, is having a stroke. And oh, I know what happens during a stroke. Something's going on with the brain, the oxygen, this and that. So I feel like that's a tool for them. That's a tool for them to use. And any tools and all tools that they can have to help them really think through this to make the best decisions they can and to have confidence in their decisions, because that's one thing that we've learned about new grads is they really lack confidence. And there's a big question mark of new graduates clinical judgment, and I wonder if, I believe that we have an issue, absolutely, but I wonder how much confidence contributes to it. And what I mean is, wouldn't it be tragic if we had, students or new nurse grads that are starting to use clinical reasoning skills, but they just lack the confidence to speak up, or they're not quite sure if they remembered this right back in their theory class. So I feel like pathophysiology, again, is another way to be able to give them that confidence, because they could be like, okay, I know the patho for this MI. I know this is happening. I might not know all the fancy treatments out there, but I know this is happening and I know this is a big problem, as opposed to maybe a COPD patient who their oxygen just fell on the floor and you have to give it back to them. So
great point. And I think it's helping students to understand patho as not just see it as a prereq, but as educators, I think we have to basically not necessarily reteach it, Lisa, but we need to basically reintegrate it into whatever we're teaching throughout the 4 semesters or 5 semesters of our program. It's not just like one and done, which I think some of us do. We have got, as educators at whatever semester, we must integrate what's relevant to patho and basically just re-inform it and just kind of realign it to that course content in a practical way.
I think so, because it's all about context. When you're using clinical reasoning and clinical judgment, it's all about that context. And so patho needs to be placed in context too. So, I mean, I'll give you an example of one way that I do it in theory is for my diabetic ketoacidosis lecture is I start with pathophysiology and I explain what's happening in the body. And then I just pause and I ask them a few questions. I'm like, all right, guys, what nursing diagnosis do you think are going to be a priority just based on the patho? Like, you make the leap, you make the cognitive leap, you reason through it now that you have that foundation that we just reviewed. So I feel like that's good. That's good to do. Every module that you have, put it in there. You don't have to spend an exorbitant amount of time. We spend maybe 3 or 5 minutes just reviewing it,
Excellent. And I just want to at least get this out. I don't know if if this student is one of yours. La Pouvière Dedu says, how do I get your conceptual teaching? I'm a student and need help. So I don't know if that's one of yours or just a student that is.
I wonder where they're from. Hello. How do you get your conceptual teaching?
You have a YouTube channel, Lisa. Is there a YouTube channel of Lisa Gonzalez out there yet? Maybe we'll have one out there soon, but not. Do you have anything out there, Lisa, or not? We'll just make this quick.
The only thing that I do have, and maybe this will help, is I have a student resource book, and I give it to all my students to use in clinical to guide them through it. So, I mean, that's something that probably could help you because it goes through each piece of it, and then it has questions and activities that you would do to kind of strengthen that. And I do have I do have something on YouTube that maybe you would like. I have a clinical reasoning lecture recorded for my students, my theory students. So some of the examples I use, like I break down something that they're going to learn about in class, but it goes through that. It goes through clinical reasoning. It goes through study strategies if you're going to strengthen clinical reasoning. And then I also have a how to study guide. So you can use this, whatever you're learning about in your class, is it basically you take any topic, and it goes through the clinical reasoning of that topic. So that way you can learn it in a way that's going to be meaningful for you. So that way you can answer those test questions. You can get ready for practice. So it is very structured in the way that a nurse would need to know that information in order to make those decisions in practice. So I'm happy to share all of those things. Keith will tell me how best to do it.
Lisa, as we have the conversation, if you're able to access the link, if you can multitask, which I think you said you can do pretty well, if you can multitask and grab that link if you've got it on your YouTube or wherever, and pop it in the chat, because I think you can also pop in the chat, Lisa, as well. And if you need me to, that might be a little bit of a challenge, but one way or another, we'll get it out there and take it from there. But what I do want to lead into, Lisa, to kind of just let me, well, Vicky's got one more question, and then I'll kind of lead into my question, or just actually the next step here, and talk about your article on clinical reasoning and that clinical reasoning curriculum that you basically alluded to, Lisa. Yeah, I see it there. Let me just copy this, Lisa, and I'll pop this. And what is the title of this? There is Lisa's YouTube. What is this YouTube on, Lisa?
So clinical reasoning study strategies, that's part 1.
Okay.
And then you should be able to get to part 2, but just in case, I will go ahead and put that in there. And then I think they're going to share my email. So just email me, and I'll email you the other sources too, the study guide and things like that too, because I don't have a link for the study yet. I don't think so.
No
but
worries.
yeah, those are the videos.
Awesome. They're in the chat. Everybody can see them. Vicky just had a follow-up question. She said, we talk about concepts that are related to the disease being discussed, not nursing diagnosis. I believe concepts are tied to pathophysiology. Do you have any thoughts or comments on that, or how do you see that question?
We talk about concepts that are related to disease process being discussed, not nursing. So in your curriculum, you're saying that you guys talk about concepts that are related to diseases, not the nursing diagnosis. And then I believe concepts are tied to pathophysiology. I think they are. So there are concepts tied to pathophysiology. So I wonder if you're talking about like the oxygenation type of concept, the perfusion type of concept, because we do both. Me and my coworker, who's my work mom, Kathy Parsons, shout out to you if you're out there. But her and I, we tell our students before you even start the semester, really go back and review oxygenation, perfusion, and cardiac output, because those are the 3 concepts that are big. Now, we start there. You have to build this for your students, right? Scaffolding. You start there. Okay, so now oxygenation. How is oxygenation different in an acute respiratory distress patient? How is oxygenation different in somebody who has a spinal cord injury? How is oxygenation different with those differences? Are relate to the pathophysiology that they need to learn about, So if they don't understand that pathophysiology, how a spinal cord injury patient with oxygenation issues is different than somebody with a pleural effusion, then they're probably going to miss a really important intervention. Because, with one, the interventions are tailored based on their understanding, just put it simply like that. So, but it still goes back to oxygenation. So we kind of start at oxygenation, perfusion, cardiac output is sort of the start of it. And then we kind of unpack. So all 3 of those would have like certain focus assessments to go along with them, right? But then when you kind of break it down and you bring it back to the pathophysiology for different common conditions, because you can't teach everything, but what are they going to likely see? What conditions do they need to be aware of to get them started in nursing, right? So you just think about, what do you see a lot of times in practice? And that's kind of where we are. And so, but then you bring it down to that pathophysiology. Okay, how is this oxygenation different based on their pathophysiology? And then that understanding is your interpreting. And so that understanding that they're gaining, they're learning how to interpret them. They're learning how to decipher the differences, because then that leads to your interventions. And that's important. I mean, I tell my students all the time, there's a lot of protocol driven things in the hospital, and nobody's going to, you get a list of orders, you get a list from the protocol, or the doctor tells you initiate this protocol. And then it's really up to the nurse to kind of maneuver through there and through their decision points to kind of sort of figure out what's the priority, or when do I need to implement this intervention, especially if you have all these PRN drugs, right? When do I need to give them? Well, you give them based on what you recognize and interpret and based on your clinical judgment. So hopefully that helps. I think I saw, yeah, okay, good. Thanks,
And
Vicki.
absolutely. And another follow-up educator just had a question about nursing diagnosis and teaching that. And I don't think you're firm. I don't think you're a firm you're not holding to NANDA with a death grip, are you, Lisa, at the university? You kind of use it lightly. But nursing diagnosis, really, it's nursing priority, the problem. We don't have to be so, clinging to NANDA as our taxonomy anymore, because even NCLEX doesn't require that knowledge anymore, and it really never has. We've just kind of held on to it. We don't need, diagnosis is just a term, but can we use terms like, the priority, the problem? How do you what are the verbiage that you like to see or that you use?
So we actually, because me and my colleague Janet Monago, who's also on the East Coast, we've had conversations about just differences throughout the country. And so it does seem like, I could be wrong, but it does seem like there's a lot of schools over here on the East Coast who still use the nursing diagnosis. So you had asked the question, are we still teaching it? So it seems like there are a lot of schools that are still using it, but are trying to integrate clinical reasoning as well, which my program, that's what we did. So we actually have a program outcome for each. We have a program outcome for nursing diagnosis, and we have a program outcome for clinical reasoning. And so one way that I've consolidated the two, because we still do care planning in my course, and it's fine. That's fine. But how I've consolidated it, because I've been using care planning for students at different schools over here when I did clinical instructing at other schools, is we've been using it for a while. But one thing that I noticed, and this is why I felt the need to do some of the stuff that I felt, is that even though we had a care plan and a clear template for nursing diagnosis, they still didn't know how to think through about what to put in their care plan. So they were just putting any intervention from the care plan book, whether or not it made sense for that patient. And that's when I was like, there's a piece missing here. It's great to do care planning. Care planning is still something that a lot of nurses will document. But there was that thinking missing, and that's the clinical reasoning part. And so I teach them clinical reasoning now, but we do care planning. But the clinical reasoning lessons that we do each week really helps them firm up their care planning, because now they're giving supportive data for their nursing diagnosis, and not just every piece of data. Now they're giving concise, focused assessment data. Now they're tailoring their interventions to meet their patient's needs because they've interpreted the situation well. So that's kind of how we have done it. I don't know. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts about how you guys are doing nursing diagnoses, because I feel like it's not something that we necessarily have to throw out the window. I do feel like practice is a little different as far as what do you do with those nursing diagnoses. And I think a lot of nurses, I always tell them, they do their care plans written, but I always tell them in practice, in real world, and I love teaching my students real world, you're going to be a nurse. Welcome to it. Let's start now. But I always tell them that a lot of nurses think in these ways. They think, oh, I think I have an issue with fluid volume right now. Oh, I think I have an issue with cardiac output right now. So they think their care plans as opposed to writing them, each one of them down. So
No, excellent points, Lisa. And what I'd like to do, this has gone way too quickly. We're not going to get through everything I wanted to, and that's okay. We're having a conversation. I think we'll have you come back again, Lisa, and we'll finish up some thoughts. But really what I'd love to dig into is your 2018 article. I'm going to put in the chat again, the abstract, Teaching Clinical Reasoning Piece by piece. And this is where you really kind of make clinical reasoning visible to your students in the clinical. So this is really where I think it's the second or third semester, Lisa, that you're doing this approach.
Yeah, third semester. So shout out to my students, CSM nursing students. Woo, woo.
Absolutely. And, tell us kind of, Lisa, the essence. The article is there. They can download it. And I commend every educator either watching this live or on the recording, get this link, get the article in full text. And Lisa, as the author, I commend you. You've been published in the nursing literature, which that's a minority. So well done. I'm going to talk to you about how to get published. That's another conversation we'll do privately. But My point is this: give us the essence of this
Okay.
article and really what it is that what can educators, everybody who's watching this tonight, they want a small win. They want to say, Lisa, I'm struggling. Our students are struggling to think like a nurse. Clinical judgment, our students are lacking, and we've got to strengthen that like right now. We can't wait till next gen. We've got to start doing this now. You
Absolutely.
have got some great ideas, Lisa. And from your perspective, what are some, just help the educators understand the essence of this article as the author, and then what are the small wins that you could kind of say, hey, here's some, yes, this is a big curricular approach and it's kind of, yeah, it's got some great, but yet here's some of the little things you can do right now in clinical to strengthen clinical judgment. So I love your
Okay,
thoughts.
absolutely. So I'll share the quick story of this. So basically, Linda Caputi had come to a conference for our school, and she was talking about just how you can teach thinking skills. And I was just like, oh my gosh, we absolutely need to do this. We use Lasser's clinical judgment rubric as our clinical evaluation tool, but I was still getting, thoughts that we're evaluating the students, but there was no organized approach to actually teach what we were evaluating. And I thought, oh gosh, I really want to add that. So that's where the clinical reasoning, clinical education curriculum came from. So basically, a few of the finer points are just that we're breaking down clinical reasoning week by week. We're taking it step by step and we're talking about it conceptually. And so what we do is we start off with a pre-conference and I ask them some questions and I explain this piece of it. Focus assessment is the example I always use. So we have a week, we have 10 weeks, 11, depending how you break it down. So 10 weeks, we'll say. So focus assessment is like week 3 or 4. And basically we start with pre-conference and I'm like, okay, guys, we're going to look at our patients' focus assessments today. So what's the difference between a head to toe and a focus assessment? So then they go in there and then I'm really trying to engage them. And I don't want them to focus on all the tasky things of nursing, but I really want them to focus on what is relevant to what we're learning about that day. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't do things, that they don't do tasks, but the meat of the day is focusing on that concept that we're talking about, that piece of clinical reasoning. The other thing is that it builds each week. And so again, I always tell them, I'm not going to evaluate you on this piece until we've, really talked about it. I'll give you some feedback of, how you're maybe doing, but when we talk about it, that's when I'll hold it to you. And so another thing is there could be a lot of downtime in clinical, but there's so many great learning opportunities in clinical, right? And so one thing about the clinical environment is that it can be very chaotic for students. And so there's got to be some kind of way for them to grasp something, for there to be structure there. So that way they can see the clinical site, experience the clinical site, and get something out of it without them feeling overwhelmed or without them feeling like they need to run out the room. Because I don't know about you guys, but sometimes students, they don't know what to do because they don't know what nurses do, right? And so you have to invite them into the conversation. So that's why I start. I'm like, okay, guys, nurses do focus assessments. Here's what they are. Here's how nurses do them. Here's a patient. I want you to do them. And so they have a purpose now. So then they go in the room with a purpose and they have something that they need to do. Then they come back up and then they catch up with me. I want to give them a lot of guidance throughout the shift. And so then I'm like, why did you choose that focus assessment? How is it guiding your care? What are some of the next steps? What are you realizing? So another piece is that we have a mid-shift conference. And I feel like that is so important. And again, there's a lot that happens in clinical. I always think of clinical as almost like a real world simulation, right? And so how much time do we spend with simulation and debriefing? And we know that the learning is happening, especially in debriefing, right? Well, again, real world clinical, there's a lot coming at them. I remember one time I had a student, we walked in a patient's room. This happens to us like every semester. I feel like the first day of clinical, okay, it's like something goes down. We walked into the room, patient decompensates, things are going down, everyone's coming in the room, and the student's just standing there with their eyes wide open. And about only 20 minutes, 30 minutes goes by, and we have like a day's worth of conversation to have. Because all of this has happened, the nurse has done all these things, and the nurse's mind is do. But now let's slow this down for the students and talk about this. debriefing mid-shift conference is so valuable. We get away from the clinical site, from the floor. We're still at the site. We're in the lobby or whatever, in the break room, whatnot. We're away. We have a moment to talk. We have a moment to compare patients. They have a moment to get clarification from each other. And so there's that learning that happens. And
How
then
long
there's
does that last, Lisa? How long, just to make it up, just really practical, how long is that mid-conference touch base or that
I would say
mid-clinical?
anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes we spend. And depending on the conversation, it might be a little longer, but generally anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. We break things down from clinical. It's also the time that I show them things. So communication week, I'm showing them like the S bar, how to call a doctor. I have a very specific activity to call a doctor. And then the rest of clinical, I give them learning activities. There really shouldn't be much downtime for these students. They really need to be thinking and using the time they have in clinical. So you can't be with everybody, right, guys? You're
Right.
one clinical instructor. You can't be with everybody. So I give each of them a booklet, and there's activities in that booklet and questions in that booklet for them to work on if they're waiting for me, or if they have a little bit of downtime, they have things that they can work on, so that way they can still be looking at the patient through a certain framework, a certain lens, so that they can gain the most from that clinical experience.
And Lisa, you were generous. You're a lot like me. You love to just give stuff away, empower educators, and say, "Hey, I found this helpful. Take it, use it." That really is the heart of your article. You're sharing your secret sauce, and you're sharing strategies and ways to do it. But what you also shared with me that I just put in the chat, and I'd like you to explain it briefly, because every educator here watching this or watching the recording can download this. This is an Amazon S3 link. So you can download this document directly, and it's called Lesson 4, Focused Assessment Handout. So this must be week 4 of your 10-week. Is that correct? Is that so it's week 4 of your 10-week kind of clinical curriculum. This is the 4th week. Can you kind of just unpackage this handout as educators are downloading it, looking at it? Can you just kind of just highlight it for us, Lisa, in closing?
Absolutely. So I think what is in there is start you off with a lesson. So the lesson is given to the clinical instructor and the students. So if you have new part-time clinical instructors, it's a guide for them too. It helps them know, what am I supposed to be doing in clinical, right? It walks them through it too. So it has questions that you start off the clinical day with in your pre-conference, because you want to get students thinking about what they're going to be doing that day. And then it has your activities for the mid-shift conference. It has what you're going to be doing, throughout the shift, post-conference. So it just has ideas for questions and activities and things that you could do throughout the shift. But there's also a section there of how it connects to the clinical evaluation tool. Because I feel like when it comes to teaching and learning anything, we want to have alignment, right? So we want to make sure our objectives, we have activities to go along with it, give them some practice to learn whatever we're explaining. We want to have time where we're explaining, where we're teaching them whatever that concept is, give them some practice time. But then we also want to make sure we help them know that how we're evaluating them. So I have a section that brings it back to that clinical evaluation tool, which is last year's clinical evaluation tool, using an adapted version. And then there's a few activities that are in there. We do a role-playing activity where the students get to act out like a stroke or alcohol withdrawal, and then the other ones get to practice using a focused assessment form, so an alcohol withdrawal scale, so that way they can make that connection that there are these certain assessments that we do for particular patients. And then there's a rounding form as well. So we go room to room to room, and I just ask, we kind of unpack what's going on with the patient, but very concise information, because one thing about clinical reasoning, we know they need to learn relevant versus irrelevant information, right? And so rounding is all about them learning how to identify the relevant, but it's also back to practical. I literally am teaching them what they're going to do during rounding one day. So we explain what rounding is all about and what the purpose of it is and how it's interdisciplinary and etc. So that is what is there. I think I also included the framework if you're looking for ideas for like your curriculum, it has the learning objectives for that day, it has the teaching strategies, and then it has the evaluation strategies all in one. So there's one template form there on one page that shows how it threads all the way through for that day.
And so if they combine that activity with the essence of the 2018 article, Teaching Clinical Reasoning Piece by Piece, they can basically put this together, at least get a vision for kind of having us. What I love what you're doing, Lisa, is that you're providing a structure to an unstructured experience. Because as we know, as educators in clinical, not every student gets the same experience. And some get a wonderful experience and some just have patient goes home halfway through the shift and it's like, okay, let's find some make work to things to do. And it's just kind of chasing our tail. And it's like, what this does is that what I love what you've done with this, Lisa, is that you're bringing structure not only to clinical, which is needed, but you're bringing the structure of clinical reasoning using Tanner's framework, a practice-based framework, as well to really just cement it and put it all as you're kind of like a curriculum. It really is a curriculum for clinical because that's you have a unifying framework to put it all together for your students in over 10 weeks. I'd love to know what's been the feedback of your students. You don't seem like the clinical instructor from hell. You have high expectations, but they're learning and they see the relevance. And I'm just curious if any of your students are out there. I want to tell you right now is your time. Put some feedback in the chat so other educators can see the value of what Lisa is doing and investing in your learning to be the best possible professional nurse. So I think we have at least one or two students here, if not more, that didn't reveal themselves. Now I'd love to see, Lisa, what your students have to share in closing. But before they put something in the chat, if they choose to, what are some of the feedback you've gotten from your students in a semester? What's kind of their, at the end of the day, it's about their learning. And, what are they telling you as you have transformed and innovated clinical? What's the feedback?
Well, I've heard things like it demystified like what nurses do for them. And so, one thing that's kind of interesting is, like I said, clinical is a chaotic environment. And so I get feedback like I kind of knew what to do. We always had a plan for the day. They felt like, and that feels like very safe and secure to them because, clinical, you're going to learn more if you're not so scared, right? So like the learning environment we create is really important. And so by giving them this structure, it almost seems like it's given them that confidence and that safety that they're like, okay, I'm going to have a meaningful experience. So me and my colleagues, actually, we did a very little pilot study just to get some feedback via IRB approval process. But I've gotten a lot of informal feedback, like I shared. But me and two of my colleagues, I'll shout out Lisa Frost and Sarah Cano. Thank you guys for helping me with that project. But we did a research study, and one thing that came out from that, the themes of that were collaboration, that they really liked that it improved collaboration between the clinical instructor and the student, and it helped them collaborate with each other because they had all these great conversation starters. It helped them put the pieces together of clinical reasoning because, again, it was demystified. It doesn't have to be this complicated, really. It's a complicated process, yes, but if you break it down simply, it doesn't have to be that as complicated for students to learn. It doesn't have to be a mystery of somehow one day I sort of get the secrets of the kingdom. No, just tell them this is how you do it piece by piece. And then so they like that. And then they also felt like it helped them gain some confidence. And that was an important thing that seems to be coming out of the literature as well, that it's not only about developing clinical reasoning skills and judgment, but we have to help build their confidence as well. They go hand in hand. So they felt like it did give them confidence because it demystified. They learned what nurses do. They got practice doing it. They were invited into the profession by doing these actual real world things under guidance, under supervision, yes, but they were invited into the profession. So that's some of the feedback that I've gotten.
No, and that is just powerful, Lisa. And I just really, as I read your article, then your follow up in 2021, we'll get to that in another Facebook Live. So we'll have another conversation and make that our focus on really strengthening clinical judgment from a curricular perspective and how we can do in our curriculum in nursing education, have a framework and strategies to do that. We'll do that another time. But I just want to say thank you, Lisa, for just all that you're doing, because you're an innovator. You're on the cutting edge using best practices, practice-based framework of clinical judgment, which is TANNERS, that aligns with the NCSBN. We're preparing for practice, and we're giving students a confidence to develop the judgment. Again, my passion has always been, are we preparing our students for real-world practice versus the NCLEX? What you're doing is both. And more importantly, you're focusing on practice, which really is what our focus needs to be in nursing education. So I just want to say thank you, Lisa. And Lisa's got an email, which means that there are some of you out there today who basically kind of like, I had a question, we ran out of time. I want to keep this to an hour, which is where we're at, but we had a wonderful conversation. And this is a recording that lives on my YouTube channel, Think Like a Nurse, the Facebook page, Keith RN, Think Like a Nurse. The link is available to share. But more importantly, for your colleagues who couldn't be here, share this link. We've got to get the word out. It's up to us who recognize the value of the work that Lisa's doing. And kind of that really is kind of what I've been advocating for years with Keith RN, and just a practice-based perspective of teaching. It's exactly what Lisa's doing. So thank you, Lisa. And here's her email address. And Lisa, you gave me permission to share this. I hope you get a lot of educators. So I hope you have a full inbox tomorrow in a good way, and, serve them well. And, we'll come back and we'll talk soon. But, in closing, Lisa, I want to just give you the last word. If you could say one thing to just kind of, as you look at the challenges that we face in nursing education as educators, it's not rainbows and butterflies. We know that. But what is it that you would encourage, or just kind of as you look at your lens as an educator and your teaching practice and you see the value of what you're doing, what's keeping you going? Because sometimes I want to throw in the towel of Keith RN sometimes. I'm done. I'm tired. I'm weary. I'm kind of like, you know what? But what keeps you going? What could you say to encourage those educators who might be weary and just need a little word of encouragement?
Well, I love seeing those light bulb moments. I think a lot of us educators do. And so definitely my students keep me going. Whenever we get to the end of the semester, we do a putting it together lesson where they put together the clinical reasoning. And it's just so fulfilling to see them starting to take on these roles and really put these pieces together. But I feel like one thing that I want to just encourage you guys to do is take the time to really dive into your passion and the literature. I feel like that's a barrier sometimes for us. Sometimes we're moving so fast in education. We have so many things to do, but I feel like it's really important to kind of slow down and pause and think about, just like a nurse thinks about what interventions they're going to do for their patient and how it might be meaningful and how it might help them, for us to really think about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and just to look into the literature to get some make sure we got some science behind us to do it. So definitely want to encourage you guys to, do that. Take some time, pause, and really reflect and think about that.
Well, Lisa, thank you again for your time. It's been a pleasure. And, we will connect another time in the future. I just want to let you all know that, I'm kind of, I'm tired as well. And I'm going to I think this is going to be my last Facebook Live for this year of 2022. I'm going to take some time to pause, reflect, kind of like take what Lisa said and say, what is I've got an important mission, but kind of what does it look like in 2023 and how can I be more effective, and what that looks like in all that I do and collaborating with other educators to bring about needed change. And so I'm just going to kind of take a pause back, but I also want you to know that I'm also very interested in looking at podcasting as an option for 2023. Should I do Facebook Lives with podcasting or just anything else? You know what? If you have some thoughts or feedback, I would also value that as well. And I think I also have an email address. Yes, I do. Keith@keithrn.com. So you know what? If you have some thoughts as educators still with us, please share that. And just final thing in closing, before I just kind of call it, I just want you to know that tomorrow I have a basic workshop that's just basically, if you'd like to learn more about what I'm doing with Keith RN and just the resources that I offer educators and just a lot of things that are free, like Lisa, you know what, it's not about a product. It's about how do we strengthen and transform how we teach nursing. I have a webinar tomorrow that's free from 10 a.m. to 12 noon Central. That's the registration link. If you'd like to join me on Zoom, I'm just going to kind of walk through, answer questions, and share what I do and what I've been doing the last 10 years in developing. And so I just want to thank you for considering that. And I get Lisa, we've got some incredible comments here. Here's just an example. Excellent discussion. Thank you, Keith and Lisa. I think that summarizes it. So Lisa, it's been a blessing. Thank you again.
Thank you guys. Nice hanging out with you guys tonight.
We'll stay in touch, and you guys have a blessed, let's finish strong this year. We're already starting November, and a month we'll be in finals. So let's finish strong, and let's again look at things that we can do from what Lisa shared tonight to even take a small step in your clinical. And that article and the things that she shared can be a part of that needed change. So let's embrace what we can do to change our content, our clinical. And it's been a pleasure to join you. So thank you again, and have a blessed semester. Take care. See you next year. Good night.